The Road to Socialism and the New World Order by Dennis Lawrence Cuddy, Ph.D. Part 5. To see how the computer might be used in the future, read the U.S. Department of Education's 1967 publication OE100, which stands for the 100th anniversary of the Federal Office of Education in that year. Toward the end of the document is a story titled 1997, in which one reads, Johnny Brooks, 8 years old, is a student in an Iowa Public Education Con Center 417. To his parents' consternation, Johnny's classes at Con Center 417 consist only of him. The pupils frequently do gather in groups for seminar-like discussions. The learning console at which Johnny spends most of his time in Con Center 417 appears to be an enclosed desk with a television set and a typewriter built into it. He starts his lessons by inserting his aluminum identification plate into the console demand slot. His console and con center, like all the other con centers around the Davenport metropolitan area, are connected to the Educational Resources Center downtown. There, the record of Johnny's progress that has been tabulated by computers is combined by a team of psychologist programmers, expert teachers of everything from arithmetic to zoology, remedial specialists, and guidance counselors. Neither Johnny nor anyone else knows what grade he's in. He proceeds at his own pace. In Johnny's world, education never stops. Learning is a year-round, lifelong process. That this story is titled 1997 seems to be right on target. After all, by May 1984, Dustin Houston of Utah's World Institute for Computer-Assisted Teaching, WICAT, said in discussion, Developing the Potential of an Amazing Tool, Schooling and Technology, Volume 3, Planning for the Future, a Collaborative Model. He said, We've been absolutely staggered by realizing that the computer has the capacity to act as if it were 10 of the top psychologists working with one student. Won't it be wonderful when no one can get between that child and that curriculum? Predictions regarding socialism along with its threat have been made by educators and in the field of education for many years. In Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America in 1840, translated later by George Lawrence, he remarks concerning potential dispositions that, I do not expect their leaders to be tyrants, but rather schoolmasters. And in the original Henry Reeve translation, de Tocqueville further explains, above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. And, after having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned him at will, the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrialist animals, of which the government is the shepherd. In the December 21st, 1954, New York World Telegram and Sun, John Temple Graves offers a similar warning concerning the subtleness of socialism, including its effect upon progressive educators, saying, A greater killer has been socialism, not communism, but its pale sister who doesn't know the facts of life, socialism. The socialism which forgets ethics and the individual for the state. The socialism which gives us social-minded preachers who neglect God and men for society. The socialism which persuaded so-called progressive educators to forget education for mere vocation and group-mindedness and to propose liberty for babies even as a social-minded state created slavery for grown-ups. This socialism is far greater home menace than out-and-out communism, for it's respectable, legal, not capable of being jailed or deported by the FBI or hounded down by congressional committees. 21 years later, the Journal of Teacher Education, Fall 1975, published Humanizing Teacher Education for the Last Quarter of the 20th Century by Edward Durchain and Robert Nash, who believe teachers of the future will be called human service educators, developing an ideology of humanistic socialism, training in the politics of power, the phenomenology of the change agent, ethical ways of dislodging or supporting those in power, and the practical and moral strategies necessary for attaining positions of power and influence. This was the year after Theodore Bramwell wrote The Teacher as World Citizen, 1974, commemorating Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards and also using the term humanistic socialism. Bellamy's book, published in 1888, looks backward from AD 2000, describing how a socialist utopia came into being in America, where money had come to be replaced by cards with credit on them, where students could perform 3 years of menial service, where crime would be treated just as a mental disease, and where a woman selected by a woman of the U.S. could veto any legislation regarding the rights of women. The date given at the beginning of the book by leading collectivist educator Bremweld is December 26, 2000. And looking backwards, he relates, actually writing this in 1974, that the World Community of Nations, WCN, began in 1990. Curiously, the same year President Bush announced the New World Order as a transnational government with its World Order Party based on the ideals of humanistic socialism. And children are reared from the nursery through high school under the auspices of a World Education Authority. Similarly, and Madly Teach, 1949, author Mortimer Smith wrote, "Let us imagine the life of an average American in the year 2000. Private schools by then will have been abolished as antisocial, and the child will perforce to go to public school, preparing him for the realization of his best self in the higher loyalty of serving the state. The state is supreme. In the future, the school building is used all day for youth and all evening for adults. Our schools under the political power will have aggregated into themselves more and more functions. If there is any unity in our discordant world of today, it consists in a devotion to the socialistic principle, of which Smith disapproved and tried to warn Americans. Perhaps the main problems parents face today concerning the education of youth is that they do not know what is going on at schools regarding their children. For example, the Georgia Department of Education produced a document titled Psychological Education, containing a group contract for students to sign, which indicated the students would not tell anyone, including parents, what happened in the groups without the group's permission. And in May 1995, the Early Childhood Development Enrichment Center in Illinois, and funded by the Illinois State Board of Education, sent questionnaires to some teachers regarding a number of students with the instructions, "Please be sure not to send this form home to parents." One way parents can at least stop the indoctrination of their children with secular humanism in the public schools would have to have school boards pass resolutions or legislatures pass laws stating that if the Judeo-Christian values cannot be explicitly taught in the public schools, then no other values can either. Example, humanistic values in sex education, because that would be discrimination. Perhaps since the Ten Commandments have been removed from schools and other public properties, resolutions and laws can also be passed to remove pagan deities from public properties around the U.S. Demeter in Annapolis, Minerva on the California state legal seal, Crease on Vermont's capital, etc. In terms of legislation today, children are being nationalized via Gold 2000, which had national and community service requirements, as well as such home intervention programs as parents as teachers. Years ago, 1793, William Goodwin warned against the nationalization of education when he wrote An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on General Virtue and Happiness, in which he declared, "The project of a national education ought uniformly to be discouraged on account of its obvious alliance with national government." And when Dwight Eisenhower was president of Columbia University in 1948 to 1952, he warned that federal aid to education was another vehicle by which the believers in paternalism, if not outright socialism, will gain still additional power for the central government. Today, Richmond Times-Dispatch editorial page editor Robert Holland, on October 6, 1994, wrote to U.S. Secretary of Education Richard Riley regarding Goals 2000. "I have today obtained a copy of the Community Action Toolkit of the National Education Goals Panel, of which you are a member. The kit makes a statement. Only by changing the attitudes and behaviors of community members will it be possible to teach the national education goals. With all due respect, sir, that does not sound like the government believes that we citizens have any choice regarding the shape education reform will take. In fact, isn't such a government-directed propaganda campaign unprecedented in Americans' history? Some of the topics in this kit describes allies and opponents, identify change agents, troubleshooting in the event of opposition, and avoid the term outcome-based education. Finally, sir, what is your authority under the United States Constitution to conduct a campaign aimed at rigging the outcomes of the education debate in every local community in America?" In Education Week, April 6, 1994, Stephen Aarons, professor of legal studies at the University of Massachusetts, said about Goals 2000 that it will lead to the creation of a national curriculum and the political and bureaucratic specifications of official knowledge. And in Education Week, September 7, 1994, Kenneth Goodman, past president of the International Reading Association, exclaimed concerning the Reagan-Bush-Clinton education reforms regarding standards, "I accuse the politicians and technicians of the standards movement of using standards as a cover for a well-orchestrated attempt to centralize power and thus controls who will teach, who will learn, and what will be taught in the nation's schools, and who will determine the curriculum for schools and for teachers' education. The standard movement promises the political power brokers that by controlling outcomes they can control schools while appearing to support local control." In Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s Partisan Review article quoted earlier, he referred to a secret long known to the British who, as D.W. Brogan has put it, change anything except the appearance of things. Another recent piece of legislation furthering the nationalization of education was H.R. 6, Reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which has been passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton. As with Goals 2000, a great deal of federal money was dangled in front of the states to cause them to voluntarily accept this ESEA legislation. Most states want the money and will therefore accept the national standards based on the national goals that go with it. To meet these standards, most states will develop new statewide subjectives, OBE assessments. Even if these are not mandated for every child initially, states' accreditation and certification requirements will soon impact private schools and homeschool students. For example, college admissions or obtaining a job will be impossible without a certificate of initial mastery, which will be obtained only by doing well on the new statewide subjective OBE assessments. Who will be at a district disadvantage if they have not been educated to meet these assessments? This could mean the death of traditional private schools and homeschool education as we know it today. Regarding the national goals, measurements can be extremely privacy invading, as Volume 108, Supplement 1, 1993 of Public Health Reports by the U.S. Public Health Service contains Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System questions to measure National Education Goal 6, which includes questions like, how many times have you used marijuana? And have you ever had sexual intercourse? And in the national standards just released for U.S. history, there is no mention of people like Paul Revere, Thomas Edison, and the Wright brothers because, as the co-director, Gary Nash, of the commission putting together the standards proclaimed, the traditional emphasis on dates, facts, places, and events was something he wanted to bury. This, of course, means that what little traditional education students were receiving will be even further diminished. Perhaps that is why the Education for Supervision and Curriculum Development just released its 1994-1995 Professional Liability Protection Plan for Educators, which states that with the plan, you will be protected against a broad range of exposures, including the following allegations, whether those allegations are true or false: failure to educate, improper methods employed in instruction, counseling, research design, etc., negative consequences in the implementation of the recommendations of research studies, and hiring unqualified persons. Once education has been nationalized, then it can be internationalized along the lines desired by UNESCO, as stated by its first Director General, Sir Julian Huxley, 1962 Humanist of the Year. In UNESCO, its purpose and its philosophy, 1948, were declared. In its education program, UNESCO can stress the ultimate need for world political unity and familiarize all people with the implications in the transfer of full sovereignty from separate nations to a world organization. Political unification in some sort of world government will be required. Later, former U.S. Senator William Benton, speaking to UNESCO, would say, "We are at the beginning of a long process of breaking down the walls of our national sovereignty. In this, UNESCO can be, and indeed must be, the pioneer." See the September 4th, 1962 extension of remarks by Congressman James Utt at the Congressional Record. Education can also be internationalized along the lines proposed by the U.S. Coalition for Education for All, an outgrowth of the World Conference on Education for All, which is sponsored by, among others, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the UN Development Program, which funds the Third World Abortions and is headed by the Rhodes Scholar James Smith, who was a senior advisor to President-elect Clinton's transition team. Recent mailing, World Citizenship, A Global Ethic for Sustainable Development, by an international community from that in its beginning about 150 years ago has advocated a common faith in a world government which states that in shaping values, attitudes, and behaviors, world citizenship, a universal principle, should be a part of the standard education of every child. Furthermore, the Boy Scouts of America have, as a part of its Merit Badge series, Citizenship in the World, promoting world citizenship. The United Nations, the World Court, and the World Federalist Association, leading organization working for world federal government, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. That GATT is among things being promoted by the Boy Scouts organization is important because the advocates of a world socialist government believe that one world economy is a necessary step in securing their ultimate goal. See page at the back of this booklet quoting Senator Malone. GATT began in 1947, and regardless the latest round of the Uruguay round of the GATT negotiations, even liberal Harvard University law professor Lawrence Tribe has said it, would entail a significant shift of sovereignty from state and local governments to the World Trade Organization. European Parliament member Sir James Goldsmith's new book, The Trap, 1994, is also severely critical of GATT. And in his testimony November 15, 1994 to the Senate Commerce Committee, he said, "What we are witnessing is the divorce of the interests of the major corporations and the interest of the society as a whole. We have a system being proposed which will result in massive unemployment, massive hemorrhaging of jobs and capital, but which will increase corporate profits. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the World Trade Organization is a major demonization of sovereignty. GATT, global free trade, is a replacement utopia for Marxism and is another one of these mad utopias." The April 17, 1995 national news announcement that our nation's food surplus was being reduced to comply with GATT also reveals the possibility that food shortages could be used by the power elite to coerce people in the future into accepting the controls. Example, population control, political correctness, etc., placed upon them in the New World Order. In his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, Zbigniew Brzezinski, CFR member and first director of the Trilateral Commission, had projected that in a technotronic society, the trend seems to be towards effectively exploiting the latest communication techniques to manipulate emotions and to control reason. Human beings becoming increasingly malleable and manipulable. The increased availability of biochemical means of human control, the possibility of extensive chemical mind control. Within a few years, the rebels of the more advanced countries who today have the most visibility will be joined by a new generation making its claim to power in government and business, accepting as routine managerial processes current innovations such as planning, programming, budgeting systems, PPBS, a national information grid that will integrate existing electronic data banks and is already being developed. The projected world information grid from which Japan, Western Europe, and the United States are most suited would create the basis for a common educational program, for the adoption of common academic standards. Today, we are again witnessing the emergence of transnational elites whose ties cut across the national boundaries. It is likely that before long, the social elites of most of the most advanced countries will be highly internationalist or globalist in spirit and outlook. The nation state is gradually yielding its sovereignty. Further progress will require greater American sacrifices. More intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken, with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position. Similarly, CFR member and former Citicorp chairman Walter Wriston, in The Twilight of Sovereignty 1992, spoke of a new world monetary standard and the new international monetary system, saying there is no escaping the system, and explains as follows. The world can no longer be understood as a collection of national economies, but a single global economy. A truly global economy will require concessions of national power and compromises of national sovereignty that seemed impossible a few years ago, and which even now we can only partly imagine. The global information network will be internationalists in their outlook and will approve and encourage the worldwide erosion of traditional sovereignty. In the European Union's April 1994 report on United States barriers to trade and investment, it states, the comprehensive multilateral dispute settlement mechanism which has been agreed upon in the framework of the World Trade Organization will oblige countries to bring their domestic legislation into conformity with Uruguay round agreements. Article 16, paragraph 4 of the WTO specifically states, each member shall ensure the conformity of its laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with its obligations, and that its dispute settlement board will be the final judge concerning whether the WTO's global rules of trade and tariffs have been met. All nations must abide by the judgments, and financial penalties and sanctions can be imposed if the World Trade Organization's rules aren't met. The Attorney Generals of 42 states were so concerned about the World Trade Organization that they wrote a letter to President Clinton calling for a state-federal consultation summit to consider the effect of the WTO on state laws. The World Trade Organization would be the world socialist dream come true, as the U.S. would only have one vote out of 123 nations and no veto, and the majority of those nations are socialist in one form or another. More than 3/4 of them also voted against the United States on more than half of the UN votes in 1993. Malcolm S. Forbes Jr. on the Charlie Rose Show, July 3, 1995, said, regarding America's new trade relationship with Japan and other countries, that it wasn't free trade, but rather the Clinton administration had adopted managed care, which is socialism-like, and the Republicans went along with it. Relevant to George Ridgway's Merchants of Peace, 1938 and 1959, discussion of economic disarmament, where through technology transfers countries are forced to become interdependent. The 1936 Communist International described their three-stage plan for world government. 1. Socialize the economies of all nations. 2. Bring about federal unions of various groupings of these socialized nations. And 3. Amalgamate the regional unions into a world union of socialist states. And later, March 1993, World Trade quoted crypto-Marxist Will Swam opinioning that the new homogenized global economy may become just the kind of grim, unthinkable place that Marx hoped it might, the launching pad for the worldwide socialist revolution. I have for some time been indicating that the strategy of the global planners had been to form regional economic alliances, for example, NAFTA, European Economic Union, APEC, etc. Eventually merge them into a one world economic system and then argue that a world government is necessary to manage it. November 15, 1994, President Clinton in Asia agreed in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC Forum, to end trade restrictions in 25 years. And since late 1994, the Clinton administration has been talking with the European Union about creating TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Area. In early June 1995, Secretary of State Warren Christopher said regarding the idea of TAFTA, we intend to give it the serious study it deserves with its considerable potential to form an element of our overall strategy. The long-term objective is the integration of the economies of the North America and Europe consistent with the principles of the World Trade Organization. Evidence that this will happen now comes from a new book, Western Hemisphere Economic Integration, 1994, by Gary C. Huffbar and Jeffrey Shalott. The book is dedicated to David Rockefeller, and in it one reads, once a group of countries liberalizes its trade in goods and services, the logic of the economics and politics inevitably points to other elements of the integration agenda. The greater of the need for some institutional mechanism to administer the arrangements and to resolve the inevitable disputes, and the stronger the case for a common legal framework. The institutional mechanism, and in all likelihood, would be the World Trade Organization, and the common legal framework would eventually be a world government. And in case there is any doubt that the world government would be redistributed the wealth socialist one, Huffbar and Shalott also write. In Europe, pronounced social disparities between the members of the European Union are to some extent addressed through fiscal transfers from richer partners to poorer partners, and they implicitly provide a quid pro quo for the ceding of sovereignty over trade and monetary policy to sub-regional bodies. Much depends on the political will each accept the creative destruction of local industries and jobs. Each country has a different threshold of economic pain and different means of sharing that pain across social groups. Those thresholds and mechanisms will inevitably govern the inauguration and the paces of an economic integration. Autocratic regimes may be well suited to force the inauguration of trade reforms, but a democratic regime seems better able to manage the political differences that inevitably arise from the resulting redistribution of income and dislocation of industries within the country. Like the NAFTA before it, A Western Hemisphere free trade organization will not prompt the formation of antagonistic trade blocs in Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. Instead, it will prompt competitive liberalization and integration on a global basis. This aim of economic integration can be seen from the following telling remark by David Rockefeller at the United Nations Ambassadors' Dinner on September 14, 1994, when he emphasized that this present window of opportunity, during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built, will not be open for long. Already there are powerful forces at work that threaten to destroy all of our hopes and efforts to erecting an enduring structure of global cooperation. Also relevant to both NAFTA and GATT are the remarks of Economist editorial director Nico Kolster regarding the slow death of the nation state in that journal's special edition titled The World in 1995, in which he commented, "Great companies now transcend nationality. Elites do the same. Although people may travel widely abroad and work for international companies and watch foreign televisions, they have nonetheless need, at this stage of history, a sovereign state of their own to cling to as children do a teddy bear. Why should Washington bow to a Geneva-based Solomon when it can become the Brussels of its own continent? The smaller ambition is more attainable than the larger ideal. Both, however, are a dagger in the heart of a dying national sovereignty." And pertaining to the European Union, the EU, the London Times, February 3, 1996, published Charles Bremner's article, "Nation State's Day is Over, Britain Told," in which he stated, "Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, yesterday urged Europe to turn its back on the nation state. Kohl said, European integration is in reality a question of war and peace in the 21st century. He endorsed the remark made last year by the late President Mitterrand of France that the nationalism is war. Kohl said, nationalism has brought great suffering to our continent. When Felix Rotten with international bankers Lazard Brothers testified before the Senate Commerce Committee on November 15, 1994, he made it clear that powerful international interests had already planned on GATT's passage and had invested accordingly. Roten then offered the veiled threat that if GATT didn't pass, then there'd be dire economic consequences. And just before the Senate passed GATT on December 1st, 1994, Senate Commerce Committee Chairman Ernest Holding said that this GATT agreement is being pushed by David Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission. Members of the Trilateral Commission include international bankers and the heads of international companies and corporations. And perhaps relevant in that regard is the new book, Global Dreams, Imperial Corporations and the New World Order, 1994, by Richard Barnett and John Kavanagh, both with the Leftist Institute for Policy Studies, who write in the book that the balance of power in world politics have shifted in recent years from territorially bound governments to companies that can roam the world. In a review of the book in the Chicago Tribune, March 27, 1994, Tribune senior writer R.C. Longworth noted that global production is not beginning to employ the growing number of people who want jobs. Even those with jobs find that the pressures of globalization are pushing wages down. This flow of money, coupled with the ease of which companies move jobs around the globe, has shattered the ability of national governments to control their own economies. The trends can only accelerate, resulting in even moral outrage, where traditional ways of life are under assault by the international forces. This understandable reaction by people who have lost control of their lives to vast impersonal forces is no more than a futile gesture in a world where no country can afford the luxury of dropping out. This is worth remembering regarding GATT and WTO proponents' claim that the U.S. can simply withdraw from them if things don't go our way. Not only did David Rockefeller establish a Trilateral Commission, but he is also a prominent international banker for some time. And on ABC's This Week with David Brinkley, August 28, 1994, commentator Cokie Roberts casually remarked that global bankers are really running the world. This is not surprising given that we know Colonel House had close ties to J.P. Morgan and the old banking families of Europe, including the Lazard brothers, and that the Columbian Encyclopedia, 3rd edition, 1962, page 2334, indicates that the Democratic nomination went to Woodrow Wilson in 1912 when William Jennings Bryan switched his support to Wilson, prompted by Edward M. House. William McAdoo was Wilson's national campaign vice chairman, whom Wilson as president would appoint as Secretary of the Treasury and would later comment in Crowded Years 1931 regarding the 1912 campaign. The fact is that there is a serious danger of this country becoming a plutocracy, that is, a sham republic with a real government in the hands of a small clique of enormously wealthy men who speak through their money and whose influence even today radiates to every corner of the United States. We know that the powers that be have not only supported other Democratic nominees like FDR, besides Wilson, but Republicans as well. To the global planners, neither liberalism nor conservatism, Democrats nor Republicans are important, but rather power and control. Relevant to socialism is George Orwell's 1984 describing a newspeak language including doublethink, exemplified in the slogans of the party such as freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Orwell explained that newspeak has been devised to meet the ideological needs of IGSOC, or English socialism, and Big Brother represents neither the failed German Nazis, National Socialists, nor the Russian Communists, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, who would fail. 1984 was written in 1949, but rather the party which will control men's minds Big Brothers represent in the book Party reveals. The rule of the party is forever. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are interested solely in power. We are priests of power. Orwell, whose real name was Eric Blair, probably got the title of 1984 either from the centenary of the founding of the Fabian Society in 1884 or from Jack London's prediction in The Iron Heel, 1907, of when fascism might come to the United States. By 1978, over 100 of Orwell's 137 predictions in 1984 had come true, such as books written by computer, forced metrification, three-dimensional effects in art, machines that translate voice into print, and the merging of gender identities. The Futurist, December 1978. At this point, you're probably wondering how, just a few years after President Bush declared a new world order and General Norman Schwarzkopf prosecuted the war against Saddam Hussein, can we be thinking that the power elite are moving towards global control just because someone named Rotem from something called Lazar Brothers makes a veiled threat about a dire global economic consequence if GATT wasn't passed? This is where a brief history lesson is in order. Felix Rotem was one of those considered by President Clinton as his first Secretary of the Treasury. His Treasury Secretary designate as of December 22, 1994, Robert Rubin, a trustee of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who did postgraduate work at the Fabian Socialist London School of Economics, 1960 to 61. Cecil Rhodes' plan for world domination was initiated through roundtable groups, semi-secret discussion and lobbying groups, with a small group in the U.S. composed of Walter Lippmann, Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company, and others. The first international leaders of the group were Lord Alfred Milner and Lionel Curtis, and operating funds came from those associated with J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, the Lazar Brothers, and others. Oil was a key source of revenue, as the World Oil Cartel was formed by a September 17, 1928 agreement among Standard Oil, Rockefeller, Royal Dutch Shell, House of Orange originally, and historically important events leading towards a new world order, and Anglo-Iranian AIOC. But Iran nationalized its oil production, and CIA Director Alan Dulles directed the overthrow of the Iranian government in August 1953 through $10 million in secret CIA funds she gave to Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf's father, for that purpose. Dulles had been a director of the Schroeder Bank in New York and an old associate of Frank Tierks, a director of Lazar Brothers Bank and a partner in the Schroeder Bank of London, according to Professor Carol Quigley. The Schroeder Bank in Cologne helped arrange Hitler's ascension to power as chancellor in January 1933. It was about this time that Robert H. Lord Brand, brother-in-law of Lady Astor, succeeded Lionel Curtis as international head of the Round Tables Group until his death in 1963. He was managing director of Lazar Brothers, and he was succeeded in 1963 by Adam Morris as both head of the Round Table Groups and managing director of Lazar Brothers Bank. Thus, the importance of Felix Rotem's statement representing Lazar Brothers before the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee in late 1994. Coincidentally, the trilateralist Rotem is on the board of Pfizer Incorporated, along with Lazar Brothers senior advisor James T. Lynn, trilateralist, Chase Manhattan Bank, the Trilateralist Commission founder David Rockefeller as International Advisory Chairman, CEO, and Chairman Thomas Lebrecht, trilateralist and a New York Federal Reserve Director. Pfizer CEO and Chairman Wayne Steer, Jr., a New York Federalist Reserve Director, and rider trucks like those coincidentally used in the Oklahoma City bombing and in the World Trade Center bombing, according to the New York Times, March 5, 1993, CEO and Chairman M. Anthony Burns, trilateralist on the board of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Remember, that the one-worlders not only want political and economic control, but religious control as well. In this regard, an indirect attack upon religious freedom would have more likelihood of success. And on November 16, 1993, Congress overwhelmingly passed Public Law 103-141, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Seemingly to protect religious freedom, part of the act stated that government should not substantially burden religious exercises without compelling justification. However, upon closer examination, what this language actually does is obliterate the language in the First Amendment to our Constitution, which provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. To be sure, federal courts have already been undermining that language for years, but those decisions could have always been reversed in the future. Now, though, there is actually a public law that indicates governments can substantially burden religious exercise if there is a compelling justification. However, they choose not to interpret that. But for the world socialist government to exercise complete control, monitoring of nations and individuals' activities will have to occur. That is why the Treaty on Open Skies is important. An Associated Press story on August 30th, 1994 AD related how the treaty would allow about 27 countries to take low altitude and high altitude photographs of U.S. and any other nations' military installations. The treaty would also provide that no area of any country would be off limits, and therefore anything and anyone could be monitored. Concerning the monitoring of individuals, USA Today, June 6, 1995, published Embedded Electronics, a Chip Off Sci-Fi, in which one reads that in the near future, people may have chips implanted under their skins with medical history information, even X-ray and MRI images, says chip designer Fadi Kurdal, University of California, Irvine. Scientists and researchers also are working on fusing computer technology into the brain, chip grafting that involves an implanted chip that could translate and digitalize thoughts. In Popular Science, July 1995, Ronald Kane was quoted by Phil Patton as saying, "If we had our way, we'd implant a chip behind everyone's ear in the maternity ward." Kane is vice president of Cubic Corporation's Automatic Revenue Collection Group. Cubic, according to Patton, is the leading maker of smart card systems for mass transit systems, highway tolls, parking, and other applications. On ABC's 2020, September 1st, 1995, Hugh Downs said, "Big Brother has finally arrived overseas. People are being watched from cameras half a mile away." Reporter Lynn Shear then says, "Surveillance cameras are being used to patrol more than 100 British communities. These are the omnipresent eyes of the law. It's the Big Brother issue." A police chief in Scotland says, "When crime and when disorder and when people fears become so acute that they are crying out for something to be done about it, then perhaps they have to give up just a little bit more of their freedoms in order to counteract it." Barbara Walters tells Lynn Shure, "I think I'm for it, widespread video surveillance." And in Raleigh, North Carolina, there are video monitors in strategic locations at the Halifax Court Apartments complex because it is a high crime area. The video images are relayed to a police substation, and the residents love it because it has been seen as reducing criminal activity there. While that is probably true, one can't help but be reminded of how the reader is told in George Orwell's 1984 that you come to love Big Brother, who video monitors the people. Orwell modeled some of his book after Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, written in 1920, in which one state under the benefactor, with this Socratically bald head, gained complete control over the world in the 21st century. Freedom was eliminated in the one state. Reason prevailed. Everyone was known by a consonant and an odd number, males, or a vowel and even a number, females, instead of by names. And all work was group activity, as in some outcome-based education today, to ensure unanimity of thought. Zamyatin's We focuses on Russia, which is relevant concerning Orwell's statement that you will come to love Big Brother, and that recently old hardliner, now calling themselves democratic socialists, actually have been put back into power by the people in Lithuania, Poland, etc. On PBS, Washington's Week in Review, December 30th, 1994, Georgiy Ann Geer and Boris Yeltsin can't last and will be replaced by a more nationalistic person. Could it be that Mikhail Gorbachev, who still proudly calls himself a socialist and heads the International Green Cross, which is collaborating with the Earth Council to write on Earth Charter, with Rio Earth Summit Secretary General Maurice Strong, that will be presented in draft form to the UN in 1997 and will create an international environment regulatory code. Like the fiction Phoenix rising from the ashes, will be voted back into power by the Russian people who couldn't stand their current economic chaos, organized crime, black markets, etc., and have come to love Big Brother's order. Remember also that several years ago, Gorbachev and Edward Shevardnadze talked of one European home from the Atlantic to Vladivostok, and on November 19, 1991, Shevardnadze stated that the building of a united Europe, a great united Europe from the Atlantic to Vladivostok, including all our territory, is inevitable. We will build a united military space as well. We will build a united Europe based on the principles of collective security. This collective security is supposed to occur under the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, with 56 members headquartered in Prague and dominated by Russia with their hopes that it will subsume NATO. On September 24, 1995, the Washington Post printed an article, Global Gorbies Bash by the Bay, in which Arthur George Cawthron proposed that maybe challenging the powers that be isn't Gorbachev's main objective. Rather than disrupting the hidebound elites that run the world, the former Soviet president seems more intent on rejoining their exclusive club. Beginning 3 days later, on September 27th through October 1st, 1995, Mikhail Gorbachev was convening chairman and host of the State of the World Forum towards a New Civilization, which analyzed the current state of the world and articulated the fundamental principles of politics and values necessary to constructively shape the early 21st century, according to the Gorbachev Foundation. That Geer said nationalistic is important because before there can be the international socialism of the New World Order world government, there has to be national socialism, which is what the world Nazi stood for in the nations of the world. In that regard, American government official Sumner Welles in 1944 wrote The Time for Decision, in Chapter 9, in which he revealed that the German General Staff made detailed plans for a later renewal of its attempt to dominate the world. When the favorable moment arrives, perhaps 2 generations from now, in the 1990s, Wells goes on to say half the mechanism is secret and will be so remain, and involves the theory of indirect complicity in 3 principal ways. A, it will try to create doubts among the people of each country as to the ability, integrity, wisdom, or loyalty of their leading statesmen. B, in critical movements, it will attempt to paralyze or to diminish the capacity for cool thinking by people as a whole. And C, it will search in each country for men who, through ambition, vanity, or personal interest, will be disposed to serve the cause. Agents of the German General Staff have already been naturalized, usually in 2 successive countries, so that their future activities will be less suspect. The major of them are being trained and appear of men of large commercial or financial interests. Over a period of years, gaining a controlled influence in labor unions, in the banking world, in chambers of commerce, and through these channels, an indirect influence in the press. When the right time comes, simulate internal dissensions sufficiently to destroy the morale of the people in those countries marked as victims.